Welcome to another War Masters Workshop tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at using wet sanding on regular non-3D printed pieces in order to create a smooth painted surface. Now, I'll talk a little bit here about what we're using. Today we're using, this is a steel legacy chest armor that I'm working on in a commission, and I just want to point out what we're focusing on are these areas where we have steel rivets that hold the two pieces together. Also, along the braze line here, this bronze braze line, there are just some really small micro pits that we need to cover with our wet sanding, and then the two on each side here of the move my camera up here a little bit. On each side of the collar plate, there are a couple of rivets too that we need to wet sand and cover up with our paint. So just to kind of give some background on these areas, I have already filled in the rivet itself around the gap in the rivet with super glue. And the reason why I use super glue versus a filler is that super glue is far more liquid than a regular epoxy. These are really tiny areas. They don't really need epoxy. They just needed something to fill in the gap so that when we paint on it, the paint will sit over the gap, will sit over that area. Both the primer coats and the subsequent surface coats will set over these areas, and we can wet sand those down nice and flush, and you won't see the outline of these rivets. The same goes for the two up in the collar area. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go ahead and prime this, and then after we prime it, we're going to do our first wet sand, and we're going to prime it with filler primer. Okay, so this filler primer is thicker than a normal primer. It's sandable, it's wet sandable, and that makes it just far more preferable for these kind of uses. You can also see we've got the masking fluid on for weathering, so we're going to try to avoid hitting any of that in the process of this. So anyway, let's go ahead and get this primed, and then we'll come back and we'll do our first wet sanding layer. We shouldn't have to do more than a couple, but let's get our primer on there, and then we'll come back and we'll look at how we do our wet sand. Alright, so we've got our first layer of primer down on our chest plate. As you can see, we did a good job with that the super glue there around the steel rivets, because you can't even see them. You can see them a little bit here in the corners, just very lightly. You can kind of see right there is one, and right there is one. But regardless, that super glue did a great job of filling this in. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use two different sandpapers. First, we're going to use, for this layer of primer, we're going to use 400. Alright, so this is 400 grit, so it's very, very thin, or I shouldn't say thin, it's a very high grit paper, and that means that it is, it's going to leave this relatively smooth. I just folded it up, and right here we've got our water. That's just kind of out of sight here, but it's behind the armor. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the sandpaper in the water and get it nice and wet. Now the sanding paper itself is waterproof, but it does hold water. And I'm going to do is I'm just going to gently start going around here. Now remember, I also have weathering on here as well that's been masked out. So I want to be mindful of that. We may pull some of that up, but that's fine. Yeah, some of it's starting to come up down there at the edge, but that's fine because we can always cover it back up. And all I'm doing here is I'm just constantly dipping my paper in and then going back to sand some more. We're going to go over this whole thing real light. And we're doing circular motions. wax on, wax off. Now, if we look real hard, we can see one rivet here sort of poking through. Right there. And there's a little bit of metal starting to lift or starting to show. So we don't want to hit that anymore. That's pretty flat. And that's very smooth. You can't really feel, you can't feel the rivets under there. Basically what we're doing is we're flattening down this paint so that it's extraordinarily smooth and that the surface is nice and even. The whole purpose of wet sanding is to create a nice even surface of paint. Then what we'll do is we'll dry this off. And then we'll let it, we'll wipe it down, we'll dry it off. We'll retouch our weathering here where it started to come up a little bit, our masking area. And then we will hit it again with some more primer. So let's go ahead and wipe this off. Just using an old towel here to wipe this off. Now you can start to see the rivets show just a little bit more. So as you can see, wet sanding, the first layer there, not a big deal. Again, we have a few little bits of weathering here we need to fix. So we'll do that, and then we'll be back. We'll do that. I'll go ahead and I'll cover this again with another layer of primer, and then we'll wet sand that with the 800 grit. So we'll be back shortly with our second layer of primer. Alright, so we have put our next layer of primer on. So what we're going to do now, since we've already done a wet sand on our first layer of primer, and this is our second layer of primer, you can see there's still some roughness here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the 800 grit. This is the 800 grit sandpaper. I've already got it pre-folded. One of the things I'm going to do here, though, is I'm going to hold this up and show you how the all of the rivets, almost lost my words there, all the rivets that we have in here, they're just about completely invisible at this point. You can still sort of see them a little bit right through there, so this will help to even this top coat out. We're probably going to have a little bit of the masking come up for the weathering, which we'll put more masking down over the top of that. But let's go ahead and get this layer finished up here. And you're going to see how smooth this gets with 800 grit sandpaper as a second layer. Yeah, there comes some of our weathering right there. That's fine. I'm going to sort of concentrate on this area right through here because this is where the joint is between the two halves. Excuse me. We're just going to go all over this chest plate here. I'm not looking to bring up any metal if I can help it. I'm just looking to smooth it out. Right through here is what we want to work a little bit. You want to feel it with your fingers. It should feel smooth. If you have some weathering coming up, that's okay. That will definitely make it feel a little rough, but that's fine because we're going to reapply our masking fluid there. You want to make sure you use clean water when you do this. At every wet sanding layer you do, make sure that you use clean water. One thing I'm not doing is I'm not bearing down very heavy on this. Yeah, that's feeling really good right through there. I'm just letting the weight of my hand do the work for the most part. And you can concentrate on certain spots. I'm concentrating here because this is where that joint is, the seam. And any area that feels rough, I'm just going to turn this. It's very similar to how you wet sand a car. I mean, if you're going to paint an automobile, you would wet sand that as well. Especially if you're doing body work. Alright, I'm going to turn it this way so I can get this collar plate, which I'm not going to do super heavy. I'm basically just knocking the rough off of it. So I'm focusing right down in here. Because of this seam. I'm starting to dig into metal here, so I don't want to do that anymore. That's about it. So now we're going to clean this off. Alright. I have a paper towel over here too. I'm going to wipe that off with. As you can see, this is really smooth. Otherwise, this paper towel would leave little stringers behind. So we just want to wipe this down. Wet sanding is definitely an evolution. It will, it's not always necessary, but it's absolutely helpful. Alright, so what we're going to do now is I'm just going to let this dry from the water. I'm going to add the next coat, which is the green coat, the first green coat. We're not going to wet sand the green coat. We're going to add one, and then we're going to add a second green coat, and then we're going to take a fine steel wool pad, basically one of these, a fine steel wool pad, and we're going to scuff the final top green coat. And when we do that, that's going to give us our final product. So anyway, let's let this dry, and then we'll reapply our latex masking fluid, and we'll get back to painting. All right, so we've got our first coat of green on here, and maybe it's the only coat. We'll see, but probably not. So what we're going to do, I don't know if you can see this. I'll bring the camera down, but you can still see there's just barely the slightest little outline of right here, some of the rivet heads here, which, I mean, it's barely there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, I believe this is double aught fine steel wool. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to very lightly, and I mean very lightly, just go over the paint in a circular fashion. And if we rub a little bit off, that's okay. Not really worried about that, because we can do a second coat of the green on here. Mainly what I'm doing is, instead of using the 800 grit sandpaper, I'm just using some really fine steel wool here to basically accomplish the same thing, but without the need for all the wetness of the paper. I do still have some 800 grit here sitting over here in case I realized if I needed it or not, but I don't think we will. I think mainly we just need to go over this with our steel wool. And basically what we're doing here is we're sort of evening out this layer. And since we've already got the green on there, that sort of, I would say that mostly preps it And this levels out where these rivets are at. So once we get the next layer of paint on here, you should not see those rivets at that point. All right. So now we're going to hit this with a final layer of the green paint, and then we should be ready to pull up our weathering at that point. And after we pull up our weathering, we're going to give it another really quick and light scuffing with our steel wool pad, and then we'll be ready to apply our weathering, or you'll be ready to put your weathering on at that point. But we'll have a really nice, smooth and somewhat scuffy paint job. So we have gotten our second coat of green on our chest plate here, and I'm just going to zoom in so you can see how the rivets at this point are pretty much invisible. Yeah, I mean, you don't see them. You barely even see, right down here, you can barely even see the seam on the top and the bottom of where the two plates were brazed together. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm just taking that fine steel wool pad that we used earlier, that I believe it's 00 fine steel wool, and I'm just going to gently go over the surface of this real quick, and I'm just adding that last little bit of scuff, and it's also smoothing out any last bits of surface area that needs to get smoothed. And then we can start pulling our weathering off. We will have a finished product here. So this is pretty much it at this point. And that is a wet sanded, it's a 2-layer wet sand with a 2-layer top coat. The first layer of top coat, we used a 00 super fine steel wool pad, and then we went back over that with another coat of the green, and then we just used a little bit, the steel wool pad, just a little bit to scuff it up a touch, and that's it. And that's how you do a wet sand and a what I call a steel wool scuff, in order to fill in imperfections on the surface that you really don't want to be there. So this method will work for really any kind of rigid material. You can use it with plastic, you can use it with metal, you can use it with fiberglass, you can use it with a filler. So if you're using body filler for something like Bondo or homemade filler, you can use the same method in order to feather it out, and then you wet sand your primer on the top, just so people don't see that it's actual filler. There's no join lines, or there's no low or high spots. So same principle. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So hopefully you have learned a little bit about wet sanding on non-3D prints, and how you can use wet sanding and even steel wool to finish your paint job and really make it, kick it up a notch. So thanks for joining me, and we will see you next time in the War Masters Workshop.